Good evening, everyone. My name is Megan Scanlon. I'm Queensland's new Environment Minister and the Great Barrier Reef and Minister for Science and Youth Affairs. Can I start this evening's session by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we all gather here this evening, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and the future. We're very lucky to live in a country where we have two of the oldest living ongoing cultures in the world in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people whose land, wind and water we all now share. And I think it's incredibly important that we protect those environments and listen and learn from the first scientists and custodians of these lands who have passed on the knowledge over thousands of years of generations. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all this evening to the event for Running the Planet Without Costing the Earth, a World Science Festival Brisbane 2021 conversation which is presented in partnership with the Queensland University of Technology. I have been tasked by the Premier to lead and develop our Queensland Climate Action Plan 2020 to 2030 through consultation with industry and community actions to reduce emissions and sustainability initiatives. So I too am very much looking forward to hearing from the panellists of experts this evening. Queensland Museum Network is the exclusive and proud host of the World Science Festival in the Asia Pacific, and I'm delighted that the Queensland Government partners with the festival to bring it to Brisbane and to Queensland. Now in its 6th year, World Science Festival Brisbane dares us to imagine what we want our future to be and how science can make that possible. After a year of tremendous upheaval and uncertainty, we turn to science, technology and human curiosity to help us determine extreme circumstances and adapt to our new reality. And in a rapidly changing and complex world, Australia's future success is linked to innovation, which requires educated and diverse workforce founded on a strong pipeline of expertise in science, technology and engineering and maths. Queensland University of Technology works in a spirit of genuine partnership with organisations such as the Queensland Museum to foster a society that embraces STEM. And I can think of no better way to achieve this than as an academic partner of the World Science Festival Brisbane, one of the world's most celebrated scientific festivals. The festival would be impossible to deliver without the assistance of the many organisations and individuals who are a part of this program. And on behalf of the Queensland Museum Network, I'd like to acknowledge all the partnerships that make this festival possible, including the World Science Festival New York team, Queensland Government, Tourism and Events Queensland, Brisbane Economic Development Agency, BHP, QUT, Griffith University and the University of Queensland. Our moderator this evening is an acclaimed journalist with more than 25 years of experience in radio reporting, presenting the documentary Making Kathy Extel. Kathy is a senior reporter producer with ABC Radio, National Breakfast, and occasional presenter on RN Breakfast and Sunday Extra. She's a former Canberra Press Gallery journalist and presenter of the ABC Canberra Breakfast Radio. In 2001, she was awarded a Walkley Commendation for her 9/11 coverage. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the show.
So I think we're all pretty aware that when it comes to predictions of the future, they're almost entirely negative at the moment.
What about this teddy bear? Should I take this teddy bear?
And as a father, I think there's room for a different story. A story that focuses on the solutions to some of these problems. So my plan is to go out and find some of these solutions and then create a vision of a different future for our daughter. So what will the world look like in 2040 if we just embrace the best that already exists?
Well, what would make me happy in the world is...
I think we should get this invention which sucks up all of the rubbish in the world and puts it in an intergalactic dimension.
I framtiden skulle jag nog vilja att man typ skulle kunna plantera ett frö och sen växer det upp en köttbit så man slipper döda djur.
Nikiwa mkubwa, ningependa kuona mazingira masafi kwa sababu nisipate magonjwa.
Well, I would like for the government to have done something on global warming and pollution, as now I think they're not really doing anything about it.
if you look at the solutions that we model in Drawdown, they're virtually all regenerative development. That is to say, the earth is better off, the people are better off, the communities are better off, the creatures are better off, the birds are better off. No matter what it is, they're better off for it than had we not done it.
So what we do is we interconnect solar home systems. Instead of building large grids, we're proposing a decentralized structure where we start building grids bottom up. You have one solar home system, you interconnect with your neighbors. Slowly you interconnect villages. Once you've collected 100 villages, you can hook it up to the grid. You become the primary energy generation source for the country. So the idea is we are like a swarm of bees or a swarm of fish that move together, pool in all our energies together.
I'm a little bit nervous because that wheel's turning by itself.
2/3 of LA is parking and roads. You could fit 3 cities the size of San Francisco in the empty parking space left by the autonomous vehicle disruption.
We can deliver the same mobility needs in large cities around the world using only 20% of the vehicle fleet.
And so as a society, we need to make decisions. What do we do with all that parking space that's going to be vacant?
Plants use carbon dioxide and energy from the sun to create simple sugars. The plant uses some of these sugars to grow. The rest is pumped into the soil through the roots. These sugars feed soil microbes, which interact with the plant, and the carbon dioxide taken from the atmosphere is sequestered into the soil as carbon.
For every 1% increase in carbon to 30 centimetres, we increase the water holding capacity of soil by 166,000 litres per hectare on every rainfall event.
When you change agricultural practices related to food, you can do 2 things. One is you stop emitting carbon, CO2, but you're also sequestering. So you're flipping a whole sector.
When you go beyond the dominant media discourse and get closer to the ground, you will see everywhere you look incredible reasons for hope.
Birds flying high, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me, and I'm feeling good. Fish in the sea, you know how I feel. Blossom in the trees, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me, and I'm feeling good.
Well, I'd like it to be human instinct to just look after the world and to care for the world.
I just want the future to be good.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Kathy Van Extel, and whether you're here in the concert hall or on the live stream, welcome. It's my great pleasure to be the moderator this evening for this discussion, Running the Planet Without Costing the Earth. And of course, we're all at a point in history where we're confronting some pretty big issues and some pretty big challenges. Of course, the good news is that there are options on the table for this transition and also transformation, and we're going to be talking about some of those tonight. Tonight's discussion is being broadcast, recorded I should say, for Radio National's Big Ideas program, so at some stage it will be broadcast on RN at a later date. And we also would love to hear from you tonight as part of the conversation, so if you'd like, you can send a question or a comment to #AskWSFB, and I'll try to include some of your questions during our discussion. So let's meet our panellists. Ever since Tesla's coil and Edison's light bulb moment in the late 1800s, electricity has been an ever-increasing part of our lives. Of course, there are many other scientists and inventors along the way that enabled the mass generation of electricity to be fed into our homes and our workplaces and our factories. But this one thing has enabled the second industrial revolution. And as access to electricity has spread, a rise in living standards has followed. In the 21st century, the demand for electricity continues to show no sign of slowing. By many, it is seen as important as food and shelter. In fact, I've got to say that my 14-year-old boy would, glued to his devices, argue that it's more important than the basic necessities of life. It is the only necessity of life. So much of how we work and socialise, of course, is online, and the internet and the cloud is powered by electrons after all. The way in which we currently generate most of our electricity hasn't changed greatly in half a century or more. Yet we now understand that it's a major contributor to climate change and, of course, relies on diminishing resources. Change is happening, whether we like it or not, and the challenge is how we can make sure that the new world of electricity gives us everything we have now and more for less. Today, we're going to hear from a group of researchers who spend much of their time and energy thinking about these issues. Our first panellist, or should I say solar panellist, is coming all the way from Germany tonight, or this morning there, and whilst he's appearing on this screen, he can see and hear not just me, but you, the audience, as well. He's the spokesperson of the Energy Centre at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, representing 1,800 scientists working on all aspects of modern energy research. His own research interests cover photovoltaics, OLEDs, printable electronics, and renewable energies. Please give a big and loud Australian welcome to Alexander Colsman. And from Germany to Brisbane, as our remaining panellists are all here in person, I'm pleased to say. Coming on first is an electrical engineer who has been involved in significant industrial research linked to the energy power industry. Richard has also been instrumental in establishing specialist teaching and research facilities, including a heavy current lab and applied superconductivity lab. Please welcome Richard Taylor, who appears with thanks to academic partner QUT. Next, we have an electrical engineer who works for Energy Queensland in new energy technologies, including solar batteries and smart devices that manage how we use energy. She is also helping develop future opportunities through emerging new and disruptive technologies. Please welcome Michelle Taylor. Hey, everybody. The final chair belongs to a research fellow whose work centres around the integration of new technologies for the production of clean energy and the impact that these new sources have on electricity grids' assets. She's currently helping evaluate the viability of decentralised renewable energy systems to generate hydrogen. Please welcome Fanny Bollaert, who appears with thanks to our academic partner, Queensland University of Technology. Well, electricity is something most of us, of course, take for granted. We just flick the switch on and there it is. But behind the scenes, things are changing a lot. In the next 20 to 30 years, where your power comes from is likely to be very different. But in order to come up with the solutions, we must first understand the problem. Most of us, and I put my hand up for this, don't really think much of this beyond flicking that switch. Richard Taylor, we're going to start with you. To really fully appreciate the path we're on, we need to sort of step back in time a little bit for when the system for generating and distributing power, which we call the grid, was first put in place. Now, you're a bit of an energy historian, which I imagine is a bit of a rare breed, but can you tell us a little bit about how the traditional model of the grid came about and how it worked?
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned Tesla to begin with. Westinghouse, is the partner of Tesla, wanted to get power from Niagara Falls and bring it down to the city. That was the first sort of idea of grids, but Edison was running out DC grids at the same time and bringing DC power to everybody's home or the people's homes who wanted to use it. So that was the start in the 19th century. Electricity then started to come into this part of the world in the latter part of about 1880, 1890. And there was different reasons for that. It started off with a social contract for security, say. Gas lighting was used in the cities to give people the safety of travelling around at night. And that had its own particular dangers. People had kerosene lanterns at home and so on. And so the first use of electricity was often street lighting, and that would establish a grid as such. And so then you had to have a generator for that. Then people started to think, well, we could have a little bit of electricity at home, and started off with a couple of light bulbs and a power outlet with a hot plate, if you were lucky. So then people got used to a mixture of fireplaces and a little bit of lighting and a little bit of this and that. But slowly the idea spread, and it moved then pretty quickly once transportation started. And in Brisbane, we had the establishment of a power station at New Farm. And you can see the very attractive picture there of the power station, which was established in the 1920s. It was put in principally for tram transport. And so again, it was the social concept that was bringing people's attention. But you can see the sort of setup there with big piles of coal and smoke and so on. So no doubt you would appreciate that if it was your washing day, that particular day, that they decided to put that on. And that was producing something under 100 megawatts. That's a very, very small unit at the time. But it's very interesting just to pause and think about, in terms of your original point, that still there would have been considerable thought in establishing that power station, which then brings power from a little distance away into the city of Brisbane. People might have thought about that and planned that for 10 years. When they established that power station, they would have expected that to stay there for at least 30 years. And one of the hallmarks of the power industry is that a great deal of planning and thought is done before anything happens. Then the establishment of whatever it is expected to be there for a minimum of 30 years, often 50 years. And so the power engineers that do the thinking and the planning and the deep reflection have to anticipate future growth, future expansion, and that piece of infrastructure requires then a great deal of input from other people.
So what we've seen, though, over the years, I mean, that started off in a time when population was very small in Brisbane. What we saw, though, was the establishment of these great power stations to form the grid in less on the outskirts of urban areas or in regional communities. And what does the grid look like now based on that model?
Well, the power stations tended to be established where there was a fuel source. And so the most convenient fuel source was coal. And then often at some distance away. So the power has to be brought from a remote place through transmission lines. And so you can see this picture here. You can see that those overhead transmission lines that bring the power at a high voltage as it happens. Then into the city where it goes from the transmission system to the distribution system. And that's the system that we see if we drive around. If the power is overhead, we can see it. If you can't see it overhead, but your lights are on, then it's under the footpath. And that's where the cables are. They're brought in there, which is what we tend to do in the cities.
But essentially it hasn't changed much over this time. What we are seeing now, though, is those coal-fired power stations coming to a certain age where there are real questions about how long they can keep supporting the grid. Could we go to the export of renewables and the role that your renewables are now playing in the grid? How much of the energy mix is now renewables in this system compared to, say, 20 years ago?
Well, Michelle might like to jump in here, but it's a little bit accidental, that growth phenomena to begin with. It was sort of a little bit higgledy-piggledy, but then house number one saw house number two putting solar panels on, so that was a good idea. So then house number three and house number one put their solar panels on.
Yeah, so now we're at about 20% of the energy generated in Queensland is renewable. Probably one in four customers on the Energy Queensland network has a renewable energy system. And we have approximately 4 gigawatts of solar out there, and our peak demand is only 7 gigawatts, so a very big proportion. Obviously, the solar only generates when the sun shines, but there's a huge amount of our population that's already there. There's a lot more to go.
Alex Colsman, can I bring you in here? Because, of course, this transition is happening around the world. It's a global phenomenon and a global challenge. Fossil fuels are driving climate change and they're a finite resource. And so what we see is some countries embracing change more quickly than others. Your country, Germany, the world's 4th largest economy, is a global leader. Could you describe what the energy mix looks like in Germany today?
Well, the energy mix in Germany, this year, for the first time, the contribution of renewable energies to the electrical energy, the total electrical energy, exceeded the contribution of the fossil fuels. So that is quite a big leap forward, but we're by far not where we have to be, because eventually we have to get rid of all the fossil fuels. So as you said yourself, the fossil fuels are going to come to an end. We can discuss whether they will last for another 50 or 100 years, but the end is clear. The fossil fuels will not be enough for the future, whether you like it or not. But it's not only about the availability of fossil fuels, it's also they have a huge contribution to the greenhouse effect on Earth, so that's why climate changes. And this is the main reason why we have to get rid of them. So if you look to, I
was going to say Germany was actually one of the world's biggest users of coal. And I think in 2019, your government decided or made a commitment to phase out coal at all of the 84 coal-fired power stations by 2038. How is that transition going, and what role is gas playing in that?
Yeah. Well, you're right. So we are facing a really big challenge because we have not only decided to phase out of nuclear, we have also decided to phase out of coal. And that was a political decision, and I have to say where people partly have not really thought how to make that transition when making the decision. But on the other side, you need those challenges to really push things forward, because if you don't have that milestone in front of you, then things don't start to move.
So is this 2038 target achievable based on current technology?
I think it's achievable based on technology. It's a matter of will and cost. And so I mean we have solar power. We know how to operate solar power. I don't think the question is in how to harvest the solar energy, for example, solar energy or wind energy, if you prefer. It's more like how to integrate this into the system. And there we are back to the grid, because in the developed countries, the grids are mostly designed that you have a couple of power stations where you generate the electrical power, and this then needs to be distributed. And this is what the grid is made for. And if now everyone puts solar on their rooftop, as long as you use the solar energy yourself, that's all good. But if you want to feed it back into the grid, then you, in principle, need a different grid, because our grids in the developed countries are not made to take up this energy. So that's something where developing countries have a real advantage, because if you start from scratch, if I may say it like this, then it's much easier to set up such a decentralized energy supply system.
So in Germany then, how are you looking at changing the grid or adapting the grid to these challenges?
Yeah, well, that's one of the big challenges, I think, where no one really has come up with a solution so far. So people are working heavily on that problem, but I can't open my drawer here and just take out the solution for you. That's a bit of a more complicated thing. And the challenge goes even beyond the electrical power grid, because you do not only have electrical energy, you also have chemical energy, which is, if you like, fuels, for example. You have thermal energy, you have a grid of thermal energy, and you have to think about coupling those sectors to use the excess of energy that you have in one sector to put into another sector, and so on. So the system is even more complicated when you think beyond the electrical grid.
Fanny Belair, could I bring you in here? You're applying a background in maths, Bayesian statistics and computer science to understand what's happening in the electricity sector. Can you explain exactly what you do? And I imagine that you're looking at the consumer as the critical piece in this puzzle. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, the consumer is at the heart of the whole system. Without the consumer, there's nothing. And we usually think of consumer as residential consumers. You know, you and me, we just come home, switch on the light, as you mentioned before, and use our appliances. But we also use it indirectly through the services we access and the products we purchase. And so there is that mix of different uses of electricity. And coming back to your first part of the question, how did I get into that? Well, 10 years ago, as solar panels were coming on the network, people were installing them, one of the questions the industry had was, what's going to happen? Where are people going to put their solar panels? What is it going to do to our assets? And that's when I started working modeling all these different trends, what we were expecting. And if you go to the next slide, that coming up, so that's a representation of the different uses, and the grid is at the heart of the system that is letting the electricity flow. And as we're putting solar panels, those flows are changing, and the assets are being utilized in different ways. And that's what I worked with colleagues to model how this would happen. And as more solar panels were being taken up, we had the trend of the battery coming online as well, and interested in household batteries and how that would again change those flows of electricity. And making those projections for the future, we're expecting higher uptake of electric vehicles, and understanding all those different components and how operating them in different ways and to suit our own needs. Each individual is using them in different ways. What does that do? And what then can be done on the network to counteract
So you've been working on this modelling, looking at our behaviour and anticipating our behaviour. But as I understand it, the take-up of these technologies by households is much faster than was anticipated. I know it's been sort of driven hard by subsidies by state governments and federal government assistance as well, but I think it's still taken us by surprise. Is that fair to say?
Yes, well, at the beginning, they was so popular, they had to actually bring down the subsidies because, everybody was interested in installing them. And, despite the, people not having as much subsidies, it's still going very well. Like, we've got more than 2.6 million households with solar PV, so that's quite a large number, and it's carrying on. Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, it'd be interesting to get a show of hands from the audience about who has installed solar in their households. Raise your hand if you have. So we're talking probably, what, a good 50%, which is pretty extraordinary. What about those with batteries? Have you gone that next step?
Yeah.
Only a couple, but which is interesting because we still are really at that early stage, aren't we, Fanny? Michelle, this is the age of disruption. I think that's fair to say. Certainly, we've had our politicians brawling about climate change, and it's been a bit of an endless Groundhog Day. But Australians have, as this audience shows, taken to solar like ducks to water, so to speak. And I noticed a figure last year that despite the pandemic, or perhaps because of it, I'm not sure, but the solar market actually posted a new record for installation in 2020, and we're apparently on track for another record this year. So our love affair for solar is pretty strong. So I'm wondering about how this now fits into this traditional model that we've been talking about and the kind of challenges that it presents, because that's very much your bread and butter.
Indeed, yeah. So obviously the system was not designed to pump lots of energy from the bottom up to the top. It originally started from the top going down, and so now what we're seeing is, as you said, the uptake of solar has been phenomenal in Queensland. It's 2 megawatts a day of solar being installed. And what that means for people who don't quite know what megawatts are, our big power stations, coal-fired power stations, we're basically installing one of them on rooftops every year based on the numbers. So lots of things going in. And so, yes, we really have to rethink about how we make the system work, make it safe at the same time, make it as equitable as possible, and ensure the security of supply. So many of you will have heard about things like an outage that happened in Alice Springs, an outage that happened in South Australia. We've had some issues related to renewables incorporating them in the network, and we're learning a lot from those issues. We don't want to get to that state in Queensland here, and we hope that through a lot of the work that we're doing to try and enable renewables across the network will allow that to continue. But it means we have to be a bit smarter than we have been in the past. We need to have more visibility of a network. I'll let you in on a little secret, and that is that we really don't, to date, have a good visibility of what's happening at the customer level, where you're connecting into the network. We can see it at what we call our substations, but right down at the customer level, our visibility is very low. In order for that renewable energy integration to work, particularly with our distributed energy resources, we need to get a bit more visibility. We can't put monitors everywhere, but we can do very smart mathematics to give what we call distribution state estimation, which gives us a whole heap of insight into what's happening on the network through monitors scattered around the network.
And can you explain why it's important to understand what's happening on that network in real time?
Sure. What happened before was everything came from the top down, so you could just look at a substation and from there you could see pretty much, you could predict what was going to happen. Nowadays, with the increasing number of solar PVs, with the intermittency of solar PV as well, we're finding that a lot of things are happening at the low voltage before they even come up to that medium voltage area where we actually have those monitors. So from an area before where, one customer to the next, it looked pretty similar. Now it's looking very different. Therefore, to have that knowledge gives us a better idea of how we can enable renewable energies to connect in. We have, at the moment, if there's too much solar PV on a network, we actually have to limit the export. We don't want to be in that situation, and so we're developing the smarts to be able to say, okay, we might have to turn it off on an occasion, but most of the time, or we might have to reduce it to a lower export level, but most of the time we can allow it to go in. We do want to reach the 50% renewable energy by 2030 targets of Queensland, and to do that we need to think a bit more smartly about how we run the network.
Well, you mentioned Alice Springs, I think it was Alice Springs, and also South Australia very recently had to switch off thousands of household solar panels. I think that in South Australia that was for the first time recently, and that was very much an intervention because electricity demand had plunged and too much was going in. Alex Kolsman, is this an issue in Germany? Do you have an issue around too much going into the grid in low periods of demand?
Not generally, because I mean we don't have as much sun as you have, so we don't have as much solar energy. No, but seriously, there are some communities where this happens from time to time, that the grid just cannot absorb the energy anymore that is produced by the solar panels, but it's not a larger problem as of now.
Are there ways of managing in Germany yet, or is this something that's evolving as well?
That's evolving. That's evolving. I have a friend working at a utility provider, and it gives them a lot of headache.
Fanny Belair, the Australian Energy Market Commission, which is the rule maker for Australia's electricity and gas markets, this week flagged charging solar panel households for the privilege of feeding into the grid at certain times. It's stimulated a lot of conversation this week. Why would such a measure be necessary? Is it a blunt tool?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, as Michelle mentioned, when you're exporting too much, there are issues on the network. That the network cannot support, and therefore there is a need to upgrade some parts of the network, and that is very costly. So a way of preventing that from happening can be to incite people to consume in their own houses, and having some time during the day where there's surplus electricity, and giving that trigger to people to let them know when it would be the best time. So that certainly, that can seem like something that would prevent uptake of renewable, but it can also enable more renewables to be taken up because there are the right signals at the right time, and we don't have to then cut the power altogether, for example.
So this is very much about education. Michelle, is that one of the key challenges as well, teaching households how to better use electricity that they're generating?
Oh, it's one of those things that for years we've hoped, and I think people are engaged in energy use and energy generation on some level, but it's always been a challenge. People do just like the flick of a switch, and don't like to think too much about it. So it's really about how do we ensure that we don't cost the earth to get this happening. So there's a lot of new smart technologies that we can do. Of course, the more the consumer comes along the journey in terms of education, the better it is. And there's programs out there that do a lot to try and incentivise that. But at the end of the day, we realise that the behavioural side of influencing has been a challenge for the electricity distributors. And, it's lovely seeing all these people here coming out on a Friday night for talking about energy. It's one of those things, it's been a real challenge to get across.
So what, for Energy Queensland and for organisations such as yours, what are the main issues that you need to consider, and what are the roadblocks in moving Australia to 100% renewables in the not too distant future?
Yeah, I think the journey sort of started with ensuring safe operation, and so through the 2000 to 2010 there was a lot of emphasis on safe operation of the network, and now we're getting into that space where we're looking more at how do we be smarter about how we operate the network so that we can allow this greater uptake of renewables. So there's an evolving piece that we're doing, and at the end of the day it's always about trying to ensure that the customers have reliable and secure supply, but also that as the middle of the day, in the last, between 2013 and 2020, the minimum demand is halved. So what's happening is in the middle of the day, the amount of energy that's required from our more traditional sources has gone down considerably. And there'll be a point in time where in the middle of the day, those large coal-fired power stations may not be needed at all. And we still need to keep the lights on, even if a big storm comes through or anything like that. So we need to have more stability. We've just introduced a program to start some battery storage in Queensland. There has been a lot of battery storage, smaller projects that have already happened, but now we're talking about some significant renewable energy storage for that renewable.
Fanny Belair, one of the side issues, I guess, to this when we're talking about the main traditional grid is the development of microgrids. Do you? I know that there are smaller sort of regional communities who are taking this on, and there are some suburbs potentially who could qualify as well. Could you explain what a microgrid is and how that may play into the energy mix in the future?
Yes, I might get some support from my electrical engineer
Yes.
colleagues, but a microgrid is basically the grid in a micro version where you have loads, so people consuming, and you've got generators. But basically, microgrids are often, around a campus, for example, or a suburb, so smaller geographical location, still connected to the grid mostly, but can be off-grid as well. And they are playing the same role, but there is a physical boundary to the main grid most of the time.
Richard, have you got a thought about whether there is a future in developing more microgrids in Australia? Are we set up enough for that, or does it work for us?
Well, if you've ever been on a cruise ship, you've been on a microgrid. So it's that sort of isolation, I suppose. One of the advantages of having the system that we've been talking about tonight, where you've got a very large power station, is that, as Michelle says, you've got energy security. With a microgrid, then you've got to translate that level of confidence back to the microgrid. And so the microgrid has to carry the responsibility. The responsibility is not 500 kilometres away. It's right there. So I think the thought about microgrids is a lot more intense. There are pieces of infrastructure that you could decide as a policy. Michelle could decide she's going to take some of the grid and turn it into a microgrid, and so the copper is there if you want to do it as a sort of an exercise. So you can do it, but the sorts of communities that Fanny is referring to, I think, are somewhat remote communities, of which we have many.
Alex Kosman, in Germany, I believe microgrids have been on the agenda. They've been in the mix. Has it worked? How much progress has been made in Germany in this space?
I have to say I'm not an expert on microgrids, but I'm also not really aware on any major microgrid installations. So we really operate with a centralized power grid here.
Okay. Well, if we're to change things, then it's useful to have a better understanding of exactly how some of this new technology works. There's a simple logic to a coal or a gas-fired power station. The fuel gets burnt, that heat is converted to electrons, and of course, that's the stuff that makes up electricity. Fuel in, electricity out, and of course, carbon dioxide. So can we make electricity without burning fuel? Nothing goes in, but electrons come out. Alex, as I mentioned, the KIT Energy Centre in Germany has 1,800 scientists with a huge range of clean energy research projects on the go. It's an extraordinary project there. Can you give us an overview of the work that's going on there, and from your area of solar technology through to, what is it, fusion technology and storage? So huge range.
Yes, we cover a huge range at KIT. So we claim to be one of the largest energy research centers in Europe, and we really cover all aspects of the modern energy system. So that starts with renewable energies, solar, of course. Then there is a quite funny coincidence. So KIT itself is located right above a hotspot for geothermal energy harvesting. And so that's a reason why this is another big research topic at KIT. I don't think that geothermal plays a big role in Australia. I remember spreading my legs in the hot springs of Mataranka, but I think that's pretty much all in Australia. So then we have water energy. Of course, I mean, you mentioned fusion energy. This is something to come maybe in 30 or 50 years from now. So this is nothing that is waiting for us around the corner. But we also have to think about the next generation of energy sources. Then, of course, if you talk about the volatile energy sources like solar, you need to address storage. This is very important. So there will be no solar without storage. We try to look at the integration of all those elements into a grid. What can a modern grid look like, a modern power grid? We look into the sector coupling. So what I mentioned before, the coupling between the electronic energy sector, the electrical energy sector, the thermal energy sector, and the chemical energy sector. So hydrogen research belongs to the latter, for example. And yeah, we try to keep this all under one umbrella so that if anyone has questions about the modern energy system, they can approach KIT and we will for sure come up with the necessary experts to help with questions.
And Alex, what would you say are the technologies most likely to succeed commercially at this point?
I don't think that we can put all onto one horse. I think we really have to diversify the portfolio of technologies. You need them all. You cannot operate just with solar. What do you do if there is no sun outside? Just to give you a very simple example. I mean, this will never happen in Australia. There's always plenty of sun, but here in Germany, the situation is kind of different. Yeah, just to give you one example. So you really have to diversify the portfolio of technologies for energy.
Well, your interest is photovoltaics, solar. Can you take us to the basics about what's happening on our rooftops and just how far we've gone in terms of the technology?
I think, well, what happens on the rooftop is you currently buy a silicon solar module that you install on your rooftop, and that's a very major technology and good to be used, and I encourage everyone to do it. The situation is, if you really want to go on large scale, you need a lot of space if you want to do solar. Of course, you can use all the rooftops, but this would, at least in a country like Germany, probably not be sufficient. You have to use other spaces. And here we again see a difference between Germany and Australia, because you have huge areas where you can just put up solar panels. Those areas we don't have. We would have to use our agricultural land, which we actually need for other things than putting up solar cells. And so people think hard about where else to put the solar panels. And so here in Germany, we also have a lot of sealed areas. We would like to use the sealed areas. And if you look into modern cities, you have a lot of building facades, for example. And so people think about putting solar cells into those new spaces, into building facades. Here you can see quite a nice example. It's not only an artist concept that was actually put into reality at the World Expo in Milan in 2016, where people have put new kinds of solar cells into those artists' solar trees, and where they generate energy. So this is probably not a good example for a large-scale energy harvesting, but it's a very good example of what you can do with solar in the future. So if you look at those solar modules that are implemented there, I don't know whether you can see it on this thing, but I have one of those solar modules here that they have installed in those solar trees. So it's not missing there. They had one spare, so they were kind enough to give it to me. And you can see, this is a solar cell. So you can see through the solar cell. And you can design it in arbitrary sizes and shapes. And so that's a feast for every architect who designs a new facade for a building, because they can play around with solar energy, and they can also do architectural design, actually.
Michelle Taylor, we've spoken a lot about rooftop solar in Australia. Alex there talks about the lack of space that Germany has for large-scale solar plants. but we have space aplenty, as he points out. And Queensland especially is really leading the charge in these massive, large-scale solar farms. I think a lot of them are yet to come online, but what role do they play in addition to all this household solar?
Look, I think when it comes to integrating the larger scale systems, well, there's still challenges, but they're very different challenges, and you have a lot better ways of managing that as a piece of infrastructure, as opposed to sort of like solar homes where you've got different people manage and maintain their systems differently. So there's that side of things, but it's also quite a challenge because the network that we run is the distribution network, and there's a lot of space, but it's in areas where we don't have a lot of infrastructure. There wasn't a reason to run a lot of the heavier capacity networks. So we're finding that there are, in New South Wales in particular, hearing a lot about some upgrades to the transmission network in New South Wales to cater for these larger solar farms. In Queensland, there's still a lot coming online, but we're also having to look at that as an option.
Well, it raises that question about how Australia does compare then with how other nations of similar demographics are managing these challenges in terms of the energy transition and those changing grids. Where do we lie?
Well, it's interesting. In distributed energy, in terms of rooftop solar PVs, we're at the head. There's nobody as a country that's as far advanced as we are, and as a state of Queensland and the state of South Australia, they are at the top of the pile. So everything that we're learning is really applicable, hopefully, to a lot of other places and countries. However, in the large-scale systems, we're probably a lot further behind a country like Germany.
Richard, our coal-fired power stations are ageing, and that's the worry. There was a report earlier this year which suggested that they may, in fact, more of them may become redundant earlier than anticipated even, because of the leaps and bounds that we are making in technology. What do you think? Do you feel that this transition's happening faster than we potentially anticipated even 5 years ago?
Well, the power stations can run for as long as you want the power stations to run. So they'll do whatever's asked of them.
We can keep squeezing the electricity out, can we?
Within a limit, no. But I think it's more the sort of facts that are emerging that Michelle and Fanny were referring to, where at various times of the day, there is so much power being generated that a thermal power station is not needed. Now, you just can't turn a thermal power station off. It takes 10, 15 hours to start a thermal power station. And so now you've got this extraordinary problem where you've got something which is basically running, so-called spinning, but then what are you going to do with the energy and who's going to pay for it? So there's a lot of imponderables that are not necessarily the fact that the power stations are about to all stop because they're too old. It's a lot of other market forces that are pushing it.
There is a conversation about transitioning those coal-fired power stations to gas in going into the future as a transition. Is gas the inevitable transition fuel?
Depends what sort of gas you're talking about. If you want to jump straight into hydrogen, we could have an interesting conversation about that.
Well, we will be talking about hydrogen. In fact, Fanny very much is in that space, but I think they're talking about natural gas in terms of what the government's arguing.
Yes. So, well, I mean, it's something. It still produces difficulties with so-called greenhouse gases, but it gets away from coal to some extent. You can't just take a thermal power station that's designed to burn coal and suddenly decide to burn something else with it. It doesn't work that way.
Fanny Biller, I mean, Australia, as we've acknowledged, has lots of land space. We've got lots of sunshine. There's a lot of investment going into these large-scale solar PV farms. Many would ask, well, why don't we just keep generating more solar and that will solve the problem with this transition? Is that going to be a solution?
Well, we do have the space, but and there are large solar farms all around the world, so we can definitely build them. Like the largest solar farm in the world currently is in Morocco, and it's 3,500 square meters. No, hectares, sorry. And there are plans in Australia, in Northern Territory and Western Australia, to have solar farms that are 4 times the size. That's a very cute photo of a solar farm in China. But you can see, how big this is, and this one is only 500 megawatts. And you can see the impact it has on the natural landscape. So this is a question that we have to consider when we want to expand those large solar farms. What is the environmental impact? Also, this land belongs to someone, and so there is a lot of negotiation that have to happen to acquire it, and there are social concerns about it. And often they are very far from, the centers of consumption. So producing it on site where we have high irradiance, high solar input that produce, this is good. But transporting that for thousands of kilometers to the centers where we are consuming them, we can have a lot of losses with the current traditional network.
I've got a solution.
Could we bring Richard in here now? When we're talking about losses on the network, this is very much an area that you're interested in, isn't it, Richard?
Yes, make yourself comfortable. So, the losses that occur on traditional power cables are from copper that we're all familiar with. I think that the 20th century was very much about electricity, and the 21st century as well, where we start to use this very elegant form of energy. But I think also the 21st century is all about new materials. New materials developed all over the place in astounding applications. And one of the new materials that I'm particularly interested in is superconductors, and high-temperature superconductors that can transmit energy with virtually no losses. They can transmit AC, alternating current, with only less than 10% of the traditional losses of copper. And they can transmit DC with no losses. So in principle, Fanny's Panda Bear solar panels there, all that is generated with DC. And if you just keep it at DC and shift it to wherever you want it with a superconducting cable, the energy gets to the other end of it with no losses. So this idea has been thought about a lot for a long time, taking the energy from North Africa and bringing it in a very large grid around into Europe, and that possibly being a superconducting cable. We also have applications. There was a slide of Fanny's there on the west coast, or there's something to be discussed in the middle of Australia where we're exporting electricity to Singapore. It's a very elegant way to transport energy from Australia. If that energy was conducted with a superconducting cable, you would save a lot more of that energy. And if you want to bring it back into terms of CO2, it's the equivalent of reducing CO2. The efficiency in the cable is the equivalent of doing that.
So how progressed are we in this field?
We're very progressed, I have to say, in other parts of the world. I'd like to see us progressed in this part of the world, very much. So in the slide which I have, there's a picture of a gentleman pulling a cable in, which happens to be in Germany, there on the right-hand side. This superconducting cable is at 10 kV, which is a distribution voltage that we have in our network. And that cable carries, well, these are large powers. It carries 40 MVA. So that, for anyone who's familiar with this, sort of technology. That's an enormous amount of energy. Now, the interesting thing about this, apart from carrying this amount of energy with very low losses, is that the temperature which that cable runs at determines how much power it can carry as a superconductor. So, if we said we will cool this down with some particular coolant, but we decide to change the temperature, so we could drop the temperature in this cable, we could double the capacity that cable could carry energy at. So we talk about peak and average power and so on. This sort of technology can deal with that. And I've got some examples here if we want to.
Yes, please, let's pick them up and show the audience and the camera.
This is something I prepared earlier.
It's show and tell now. So perhaps if you could describe what you've got there, Richard.
Yes, so in my right hand I've got some copper cable, which overall the cross-section of the copper cable is about 100 square millimeters. And it can carry, say, 200 amps, 250 amps. In this hand, which is my left hand, it might be different to you, is a superconducting conductor, which the superconducting material is 10 millimeters across and 1,000th of a millimeter thick, 1 micron thick. And this material, the superconducting material, can carry about 300 amps. And if I cooled it down to, say, hydrogen temperatures, it could carry 1,000 amps. So this material, at low losses and carrying enormous amounts of power, could be in the mix, particularly in Australia, with these very large solar opportunities, and moving energy from where it's inconvenient to be because we don't want it there, back into places where it's most useful.
Alex, is superconductivity in the mix with KIT?
Yes, there are superconductivity activities at KIT, and also there is a connection to the Queensland University of Technology, and both institutions want to collaborate on that topic. So yeah, we're excited to see what's coming up there.
Michelle Taylor, is this something that distributors are interested in?
Yes, Michelle said yes, I think.
Absolutely.
The deal's done.
Hang on a minute. No, definitely we're interested in that, and it's not being deployed at this stage. It's certainly an area that we're watching, but it's not an area that we've actually taken any big steps in, unfortunately, not to date.
So there's obviously some very big hurdles still to leap, Richard. Is it more about getting the investment for more R&D? What is it that is the real roadblock here?
There's a number of roadblocks. It's an emerging technology. The installations that have been put in around the world, the one we showed there at Essen, has been in service for about 7 or 8 years with no particular difficulties. There's installations around the world running under similar circumstances. It's a question of the industry any industry getting used to a new technology, new standards, new way of doing things. And it's just got a natural cycle. The question is to try and get people familiar with it as soon as possible, because as I say, a lot of things are moving very quickly. Even though it's an emerging technology, it's proved. It's a little more expensive than a conventional cable, but it can carry 2 and 3 times more energy. So the arithmetic needs to be thought of in a different way, and the applications are slightly different.
Michelle?
There's also the need to take advantage of what we've already invested in and ensure that we get the most out of that. So that's part of the challenge is across Australia there's a lot of infrastructure already, millions of kilometres of network. And I don't disagree with Richard that we have to take steps. Losses on our networks are there, and they themselves cost. So these opportunities are great, but it's if you build it again from scratch, we do it in a totally different way. based on renewables, based on superconductivity, based on hydrogen, all the opportunities that are there. But what we're trying to do is ensure that we don't cost the Earth in getting to where we need to go, and ensuring that we have a system that's going to utilise the expended dollars already.
And as we're reshaping the system, Michelle, is there a discussion amongst all of the states and the Commonwealth about consistency? Are we going to see another railway gauge fiasco in Australia with our energy?
Well, I certainly hope not. There's certainly a lot of conversations, and there's a lot of people that are working together. All of us distributors of electricity across Australia, we're all part of what's called the Energy Networks Australia, and as part of that, we work together to formalise standards and standardisation. But a lot, as new products emerge, it's quite, it takes a bit of time to get us all aligned and lining up to the right standards. So at the moment, for example, we're working very hard on ensuring that all the solar PV systems that we connect, or whether you're connecting it in South Australia or in Queensland or in Western Australia, that it does require the same rules, and the manufacturers build the products to some minimum standards.
Now, we're starting to look at the clock here and running out of time for covering some pretty big topics, including hydrogen, Fanny. But before we go to hydrogen, I cannot have an energy conversation without talking about nuclear, because I know we've had a tweet asking about nuclear. Richard, in terms of nuclear power, last year the federal government flagged emerging nuclear technologies as part of our energy mix in the future, but then raised the engineering, cost and environmental challenges. Is nuclear the elephant in the room right now, at least in Australia?
We have a third of the planet's high-quality uranium ore in Australia, and we export that around the world. If you wanted to make a policy decision that you wanted effective baseload that didn't produce CO2 once it was running, you'd think seriously about nuclear. But like all these discussions, the same discussion as Michelle said, if you take the position where you've got a thoughtful investment in existing infrastructure and you want to be prudent in the management of it, that's one discussion. If you want to have a different discussion where you've got a sense of urgency, or you've got a different set of priorities, or you sort of go on to the equivalent of a war footing where the rules change, then certainly you would look at nuclear.
Alex Colsman, Germany announced a phase out of nuclear plants after the Fukushima disaster in Japan. How far has that progressed? Is there no nuclear power being used in Germany now?
No new nuclear power. We're on track phasing out the nuclear power plants. And that is a decision that is backed up by the entire society. So, you should never say entire, but the majority in the society. And so right now we don't see any way back into nuclear.
Are you importing nuclear from France, though? Somebody suggested that was the case.
Don't ask me about the actual numbers. There is some nuclear power imported from other countries, that's true. But this is also something that is going to decline in the future. Okay.
Now, I talked, just picking up on superconductors, Richard, I came across an article in researching this discussion, and there was an article that was touting the value of superconductors in the economics of wind power. Is that, I mean, we don't hear a great deal about wind power in Australia. The conversation seems to be really around solar. I think Germany is much more interested in wind. Is that the case? And would superconductors change the game for wind?
Yes. In general terms, if you have got an electrical machine made from using copper and you decide to design and implement it with superconductors, you can make it half the size and half the weight. And so for the same civil, physical infrastructure, you can get twice the amount of energy out of it. And so there's been pilots of that done in Europe. to prove up this technology and prove that that's the case. And so you can take advantage of it in that sense.
Okay. And Alex, can I bring you in here about your work that you're doing around organic photovoltaics and how they might be coming to a billboard building or a face near one of us very soon? What makes them organic?
Yeah, so first of all, Richard said current research is a lot about new materials, and that's not only true for the superconductors, that's also true for photovoltaics. People are looking into a number of new materials that have advantages over the current silicon technology, or that can be used to address new markets that cannot be addressed by silicon. I've already mentioned one of those markets, and that's facade integration. You don't want to have silicon solar cells in your facades because they just simply don't look very nice. Now, what makes the solar cells organic? Most people, when they hear organic, think about the apples that they can buy in the supermarket. We don't make solar cells out of apples. Our semiconductors that we use are organic. And if you listen to what your chemistry teacher said at school, then you know organic materials are materials that contain a lot of carbon. So carbon-based molecules. And you have a lot of opportunities to change the properties of these carbon-based molecules. And that's how you can design a broad portfolio of organic semiconductors with different properties. And some of them can also be used for solar. I brought you one example for those solar cells, for those organic solar cells that I have here in my hand. Now it's on my nose. It's probably the coolest solar cell that you have ever seen. And if you listen to what I said before about facade integration, so this is kind of my facade now. If you listen before what I said about facade integration, you will be smart enough to spot the solar cells immediately. So I'm actually looking through the solar cells at you. So these sunglasses are designed with solar cells in the actual glasses. This is probably not going to change our energy problem for the future, but it gives you a very nice idea of what you can do with this new technology. And that's what I meant when I said you can address new markets. So this is a market of mobile applications.
So Alex, where would you use solar cells in a sunglass? I mean, how would you apply that?
Yeah, well, one thing that you can do is you can power hearing aid. That's kind of an obvious application. You could also power some sensors that tell you have seen enough of the Australian sunlight. You better move into the shade, otherwise you get burned or something like this. So this is what you envisage when you address or when you discuss those mobile applications. But again, what works on the small scale also works on the large scale. If you can integrate the solar cells here into the glasses into these glasses, you can also do that on large scale. Think about the office buildings that you have in cities these days. They have all large glass facades. Those glass facades need to be shaded for people behind the glass facades not to be grilled. And if you shade the glass facades anyway, why not use the power that you absorb and generate some electricity?
That's really thinking outside the box. Fanny, we've got to bring you in here to talk about hydrogen, because we've talked about solar, we've talked about wind, with superconductivity, nuclear. We hear a lot increasingly about the role of hydrogen. Tell us a little bit about what the potential is for hydrogen in this conversation around our energy needs going into the future.
Yes, well, hydrogen has been identified as a critical factor in the decarbonization transition. But before I go into the detail, we need to keep in mind where hydrogen is coming from, because there are different sources from which we can extract hydrogen. It's not available freely on Earth. We need to extract it from other sources. And currently we are extracting them from coal and gas. And that's what we call brown or grey hydrogen. and there are some CO2 emissions from that, unless we have some carbon storage, carbon capture and storage, which makes it blue then. But the real, what we hear a lot about lately is the green hydrogen. So using renewable sources to extract the hydrogen from water, sustainable water. And that makes it, without any CO2 emissions.
And so what is the potential for hydrogen? How far progressed are we in developing this technology, and how would it be applied?
Well, so hydrogen has got many characteristics. It can be used to electrify as a storage mechanism. Like if you have large solar output, if you have too much and you need to curtail it, instead of preventing that solar from being utilized on the grid, you can divert it to an electrolyzer to produce hydrogen that you can later on use through a fuel cell to regenerate, to produce electricity at times where there is not enough power coming through. So it can be used as a storage, but it can also be used as a fuel for different vehicles. We're talking about, forklifts are already using hydrogen, but there are some buses coming online, some trains, so different vehicles and even passenger vehicles are expected to. There are already some existing, but there will be an uptake of passenger vehicles in different countries fueled by hydrogen and hopefully green hydrogen.
And so when do you see, or do you see hydrogen, green hydrogen, coming into play in our grid?
Yes, well, we are working at QUT on producing green hydrogen, and we've got a facility at Redlands that is being built. And we're using solar panels on site, using water, and splitting that water into hydrogen and reusing it. But we can also, so this is used for export, and we have the system, the different components that are being put in place. And when we are talking about integration at the system level, we're also looking at integration of the different components within the plant to make it flexible. And so when we have different levels of demand, and we can cater for that. And you can see on this screen, all those different elements are composing the microgrid in a way. That's where we're coming back to that system. And the hydrogen that is being produced at Redlands is for export. But you can imagine that you're putting this microgrid within the big grid. That is something that we would like to see happen. And that microgrid then acts as a storage system that brings flexibility to the network, but also that can be used, you can envision that it will be the future petrol station. So you could have, a fuel cell, supplying electricity for your battery electric vehicle, but you could also have a pump station in a way, but with hydrogen for your electric vehicle.
Michelle Taylor, how closely are you, as a energy distribution network, how closely are you looking at the potential for hydrogen?
Absolutely, we're looking at it a lot. Along with any of the storage technologies, when you start to see the numbers of how many solar PV systems in the network, there's going to be a point in time in which we're generating more than we're using. Where does it go? How do we overcome those hurdles of, the peak in the evening? So utilising batteries, utilising hydrogen storage will give us that ability to convert to a greater percentage of renewables. But there'll still always be a point where it gets to be more and more. And so there's got to be additional takeoff. So whether it's for vehicles or whether it's to export energy as hydrogen, all of those are on the radar.
Well, we've got about 10 minutes to go, so we might look at our ultimate aim of our energy transition, which of course is 100% renewables that sits together and works together well in a variety of grid models. So let's finish this conversation by painting a picture of where we need to be only in a few decades and the optimistic view of getting there. Alex, could I start with you? What do you think the future holds for energy technology? Do you think that something like fusion will emerge to have a place?
So first of all, if you think about a couple of decades from now, I think that everything will be renewable because, in my opinion, that's the only way forward. Anything else can be some interim solution, but ultimately everything will be renewable. There is no other way. Talking about fusion, fusion is an interesting technology. So fusion is about mimicking what happens inside our sun, where hydrogen is fused to helium, and over this process, some energy is released that is then sent out from our sun in form of light. And this is something that people also would like to mimic on Earth and use this energy. If that works, this would be a very, very nice technology to cover huge amounts of energy demand. However, it's not straightforward to mimic on Earth what happens inside the sun because we have completely different conditions here. And so that people used to say 50 years ago that in 50 years we will have nuclear fusion. If you talk to nuclear fusion researchers today, they will tell you, well, in 50 years we will have nuclear fusion. That's kind of a running gag on nuclear fusion. It will be interesting to see what they say in about 50 years' time. But anyway, this technology is too nice to not being researched because if they make it work, it's really worth every effort.
Fanny Boulet, do you envisage a different science and technology future for Australian energy? Will it be hydrogen, or will we like it?
Well, I hope there will be hydrogen in the mix, and that it will, play the role that we are hoping it will play. I think we will like it if it's green. Why not? It has a lot of potential for different aspects.
Richard, I think what we're really hearing here is that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to our problems, not only here in Australia, but globally. When we talk about New Zealand, for example, obviously great geothermal resources. We've got lots of sun. Others have got lots of wind. There's wave power. What sort of future are you envisaging for us?
I mean, it turns out we've actually got lots of thermal too. We've got a lot of hot rocks in the middle of the continent, but they're a long way away. So you'll have to use some superconducting cables to bring the energy back. But you get the energy for nothing. I think that if we're talking a couple of decades, it's got to be hydrogen combined either with something like pumped hydro and or nuclear for baseload security. I think large solar, that is concentrated solar, to minimise the impact on the land, the footprint on the land. Concentrated solar PV should be used, the renewable should be used for industrial processes, for hydrogen. And then my good old favourite, superconducting cables used where it's appropriate to transmit large amounts of energy at low losses.
In the show of hands earlier, we had a couple of people indicated that they had battery storage already. Clearly, that's still a frontier that we need to tackle. How far down the path do you think we are from batteries becoming much more mainstream in households?
Well, as I said, I think 21st century is the age of materials, and we've got first of all, such extraordinary calculating capability, simulation capability, and measuring capability that it's very difficult to predict where that goes. Michelle does a lot of work with batteries and with new chemistries with batteries. There's a huge amount of work to go there. We always have got to measure energy density. That's always the way we think about it. We take a litre of petrol and we say, there's a litre of petrol, and we say, how much energy density is that? And then we think about, okay, is this battery look like the same as this or smaller than that? And so we've got some way to go to match that sort of thing.
Michelle Taylor, where do you see our future in the next couple of decades?
I think as individuals, there'll be many more houses with batteries. I think we'll see a ramp like our solar adoption in batteries. So a lot of people will end up with batteries in the home, whether it's specific appliances that use batteries or the whole house. I think electric vehicles will be part of that mix as well, whether it's just vehicles standing on their own or vehicle-to-grid type of connections or vehicle-to-home connections. I think that in Queensland, we're blessed with a lot of load dispatchability also, and I think that's going to be something that continues to be fostered by our country as a whole in order to balance the mix. And we will see quite a diversity of ways in which we're going to generate power, where we're going to generate power. I think one of the things that probably 10 years ago there was a fear that the grid would become redundant, but I think what we have seen is that the grid itself is the means, part of the means to the end, and that it will remain. It will hopefully change over time, but it will remain as part of that sharing ability to ensure that we don't have, an over investment at individual places just to take advantage of that single peak demand that each house has, each area has.
I think that sharing capability is very important. We've got a grid that's 5,000 kilometres long in Australia, and we're connected from Queensland, far north Queensland, down to South Australia, and so that's quite unique. And as Michelle says, we're all sharing that. We all interact with one another. But that sharing gives a measure of security and also stability.
I would like to finish on the kind of investment that's going into a lot of these new technologies. There's a lot of exciting things that are being looked at, and obviously Australia has a world-leading class of researchers in this space. But I wonder, perhaps, Richard, your reflections on just how much support there is from industry to drive this technology and this research.
Are there any politicians out there? You're asking an academic, is there enough support?
No, well.
It's difficult comparatively to take Australia and compare ourselves with our friend Alex in Germany. He doesn't know what we're talking about. He's got no problems. But Germany has this... I'm not looking, Alex. They've got a different industrial base. We've got the industrial base we've got. We've got the population we've got, but we've got a continent the size of North America. If the government is confronted with what to do with the tax take of a population of 25, 26 million, even with the extractive industries we've got, it still comes down to, well, schools, health and police are going to come first, and then that comes second. So I can sort of understand it, but it's priorities, and at the end of the day, we're always dissatisfied with the level of support we get from industry. It's always quite difficult work to talk about longer-term research. We don't tend to have the appetite of long-term research that we have, that you see, for example, in North America. So Bell Labs developing the telephone. You think of all the technology that's come out of Bell Labs, the transistor, all those sorts of long-running things which are basically paid for by a telephone company. It's hard to find those sorts of examples in Australia, unfortunately.
And just on that final note, Alex, I think what Richard was referring to is that in Germany there perhaps is a much greater willingness by industry to invest in these technologies compared to what's going on here. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
I don't want to compare this to Australia because I don't know enough about the particularities in Australia. It really depends. I mean, there are some industries that are more conservative than others, and we have a broad variety of industries to choose from. So usually we find partners for what we're going to do. But just to comment on one thing that Richard said, if a scientist is satisfied with what he gets, then he does something wrong. So it's in our DNA to not be satisfied.
Well, on that note, we might conclude this discussion, running the planet without costing the Earth. There's no doubt, of course, that we have some pretty big challenges ahead as we move to that new energy future, but it is exciting to hear about some of that incredible research that's going on to developing and improving solutions. Now, on our panel tonight was Alexander Colsman, spokesperson of the Energy Centre at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, representing 1,800 scientists busily working on all aspects of modern energy research. Richard Taylor, Associate Professor in the School of Electrical Engineering and Robotics at QUT. Michelle Taylor, Manager of Intelligent Grid New Technology at Energy Queensland. And Fanny Belair, a Senior Research Fellow in the Centre for Clean Energy, Technology and Practices at QUT. Please thank them. And thank you all for coming along this evening. Have a wonderful evening.